Jews. And in the course of that tirade, he says, in their effort to keep us from speaking to the Gentiles, that's the Jews, in their effort to keep us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved, in this way they always heap up their sins to the limit. The wrath of God has come upon them at last. I think that is a comment on this, put an end to sin. The Jews are, over time, continuing to heap up sin upon sin. The longer they reject Jesus as Messiah, the more they heap up sin upon themselves. And so this 70 weeks is meant to accomplish the bringing to the end of sin. Atone for iniquity. How does one atone for iniquity? Can you atone for iniquity? Can I atone for iniquity? No, there's only one who can atone for iniquity, and that's Jesus. And so I think we have in this prophecy in 539 BC a picture of the atonement of Jesus for iniquity. He doesn't know how that's going to happen. He just knows that that atonement is going to occur. Bring in everlasting righteousness. When are we going to see everlasting righteousness? When? Okay, we're going to see in the millennium the beginning of this everlasting righteousness, and then at the conclusion of the millennium, when Satan is finally thrown into the burning fire, we will see an everlasting righteousness. But what is this righteousness that we're going to see? It is Jesus. Jesus is the only righteous one. And Jesus is the only one who can bring in this righteousness to earth. And then seal, vision, and prophet. This was one that I struggled with for a time. But essentially what that means is all the prophecies and visions that have been recorded in the Old Testament and the New Testament are going to be sealed up and verified as they were true. All the prophecies about Jesus and what he was going to do are going to be demonstrated to be true. All the prophecies about what God was going to do and all of his actions with regard to his people, the Jews, are going to be seen to be true. They are going to be sealed up. And then anoint a most holy place. What was the most holy place? What was the most holy place for the Jews? The temple is a good starting point. The Holy of Holies within the temple was the most holy place for the Jews. When the first temple was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, Ezekiel made some comments about that, in which he said he saw the Shekinah glory of God leave the Holy of Holies. And it has never returned since then. There is no indication that the Shekinah glory returned to the second temple. The second temple was built. There was a Holy of Holies, obviously. But whether or not it contained the Shekinah glory of God the Father is really doubtful. And so what we see here is a prediction that the glory of God is going to return to the temple. What temple is it going to return to? Well, again, in Ezekiel chapters 40 and onward, it talks about the building of the temple, and most scholars believe it's the temple in the millennium that's being built. And some scholars believe that in the millennium, Jesus will rule from the temple, from the sanctuary in the temple, because we know him as prophet, priest, and king. He is all three. And so it kind of makes sense that in the rebuilt temple, he will be there in the temple. He will be worshiped, but he will also be our ruler during that time in the millennium. And so this prophecy is about the millennium. It's the closest Daniel gets to a prophecy about the millennium. But this is what God was telling Daniel to record. Okay, so let me explain the 70 weeks. I want to go through this pretty quickly because I have a chart that follows that will help put all this in perspective. A week is 7 years. It's kind of a day-year theory. So if you have 70 weeks of years, you're going to have 490 years. The weeks are segmented. As we read, they talked first about 7 weeks or 49 years. And what are those 49 years? Well, we'll look at that when we get to the chart. Yes? Because if you took it 7 days, then in 70 weeks, none of the things that were just talked about, the purpose for the 70 weeks, will have been accomplished. And so most scholars, regardless of what side of the debate you want to be on, most scholars do put a day equals a year to this prophecy, and pretty much agree that we're talking about 490 years. And all of the debate is more about how it segments rather than about the literal unfolding in the number of years. The number of days absolutely makes no sense. There is nothing spectacular about 70 weeks from the time that Daniel receives this prophecy. Whereas there is a lot of things that can be explained by a day equaling a year. We'll get to the chart here in a minute. Okay, 62 weeks are 434 years. And 1 week equals 7 years. And so we've been segmented into 49, 434, and 7 years. And there are key events that occur after the 69 weeks or the 483 years. If you add the first two, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, there are some key events that occur after the 483 years. And one of those is the triumphal entry in 32 AD, again using a day equals a year, and the crucifixion in 32 AD, and the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 AD. Those are all key events that occur at the conclusion of the 69 weeks. The first one, the triumphal entry, ushers in the end of the 69 weeks. And then the crucifixion follows after that, and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple follows even further along after that in 70 AD. So, oh boy, can you read that chart? Okay, well, let me explain this chart to you. Down the left are key dates, and I'll go through that with you. And down the right are things that we read from Daniel chapter 9, beginning in 539 BC and going on down to what he has outlined there. And what I've done is, let me go through the key dates. 1050 BC is when Saul was appointed king, or anointed king. 605 BC is when Nebuchadnezzar first invaded Jerusalem and deported key leaders away to Babylon. 586 BC is when Nebuchadnezzar got sick and tired of the Jews and came and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and carried off the temple artifacts to Babylon. 539 BC is the time that this prophecy was given to Daniel, but it's also the time that Cyrus released the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, and he gave him all the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off from the temple. 458 BC is when Ezra returned to Jerusalem, and he had a decree in his hand that enabled him to do that. And in 445 BC is when Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, and he had a decree in his hand to take care of that. So, the idea is that we're going to go with the decree that is mentioned here in the book of Daniel, is this decree in 445 BC. There's a lot of discussion between these two dates about that, but we're gonna go with 445 BC, and just for discussion tonight. And so the 7 weeks, 49 years, from 445 BC to 395 BC, are the time it took Nehemiah and the Jews to really rebuild the city. And this passage in Daniel talks about it would be rebuilt, moats and whatnot. And so that's what the first 49 years were about. And then it talked about the next 62 weeks, or 434 years, 2 of which add up to 483 years, would continue to be times of difficulty. And after 483 years, we come to 32 AD. Now, if you add 32 and 445, you get 377. You get 477. How does that relate to 483? Well, the 483 years are Jewish years. The Jewish calendar is 360 days. The Gregorian calendar is 365 days, plus leap years and the like. And so if you look at the number of years in the Jewish calendar for 483, it comes up to a number of days. And when you count out those same days in the Gregorian calendar, you come up to 32 AD. And 70 AD is when Titus, the Roman general, came and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Now I have question mark years here. There's general agreement that there's a gap between the 69th year and the 70th year. The disagreement is over the length of the gap between the 69th year and the 70th year. I'm of the school of thought that this gap between 32 AD and the 70th week, which is the time of the Jews' tribulation, is the time of the church age. Now, for Daniel, there was no understanding that there was going to be a church. He has no understanding, so he can't speak to what's going to happen in that gap. He speaks a little bit to what's going to happen in that gap when he talks about wars and desolations, but he can't speak to the length of that gap. He can't speak to what's going on in that gap other than that there will be wars and desolations. And chapters 11 and 12 kind of describe the wars and desolations that will be going on. And then we come down here to tribulation. When that's going to be, we don't know. And now comes the explanation of the two interior columns. I have identified two kingdoms here. The first kingdom age, which went from Saul until 586 BC. The last king, Jehoiakim or Jehoiada or whoever the last king was, at the time of the exile to Babylon. And then a second kingdom age. And who's going to be the king in the second kingdom age? Jesus is going to be the king in the second kingdom age. So along with the king